Today we're going to take a look at the Fast Brass exhibit at the Savoy Automobile Museum in Cartersville, Georgia. I'm Steve Starling, a volunteer docent here at the museum. The exhibit ran from October 4 of 2022 through January 29th of 2023. We're doing this for the archives of the museum, so for the record, today's date is January 23rd, 2023. Let's get started. The brass car era ran roughly from 1895 to 1915. Brass is an alloy that is basically 2/3 copper and 1/3 zinc. It was a carryover from the days of horse-drawn carriages that had brass lamps and fittings. It was beautiful, functional, and tarnish resistant if you kept it polished. It was also used under the hood in radiators and in some other engine parts. A remarkable thing about the cars in this exhibit is that many of them are made by car makers that you might never have heard of. During the brass car era, there were over 1,000 U.S. car manufacturers before the industry began to shake out. The Great Depression in the late 20s and 30s took care of most of them. People having trouble putting food on the table couldn't afford to buy cars. You know, you can't just pull out a key and go start one of these cars. There were steps involved, like priming the cylinders with gasoline or turning a crank to start them. Also, if you knew how to start, drive, and stop one of these cars, that didn't necessarily mean you would know how to start and drive the one next to it. There was little standardization in the industry from a how you drive it standpoint or how you build it standpoint. Some of these cars were right-hand drive cars, which was a carryover from the horse and buggy days, and some were left-hand drive. These companies were still trying to figure it out. Two more things. First, with the exception of the Model T Speedster that we're going to take a look at, these early cars were not affordable to the average American. The average price for most of these cars that we'll see today was about $3,000, and that translates to over $100,000 today. But that doesn't mean that they aren't significant. Catering to the wealthy customer kept the technology moving forward until the Model T and some others became available to the masses. Several cars in the exhibit are race cars, and several more could easily go racing. Racing played a big part in the evolution of the automobile in that it motivated people to innovate and improve performance of the engines and other automobile systems. The endurance races that we'll talk more about helped convince normal folks that cars could be an affordable, reliable, daily source of transportation. The cars in the Fast Brass exhibit are an important part of history, and they had a big influence on the development of the car into what we know today. Now let's go take a look at these cars. So it's interesting to me how many of these early automobile companies were based in Indiana or had their roots in Indiana. I tried to figure out why that might be the case, and nothing seemed to point to a single reason. But the upper Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, that area was the hotbed of automotive activity in the U.S. throughout the 20th century. A lot of the cars in the Fast Brass exhibit were made in Indiana, including this beautiful 1907 American Underslung. The manufacturer was the American Motor Car Company, based in Indianapolis. That company had nothing to do with the American motors we remember, it just had American in its name. These brass cars had huge pistons. This one is a 4-cylinder, 476 cubic inch engine that generated only 50 horsepower. But that was good in the early days. So how did this Roadster come to be known as the Underslung? The story is that the chief designer for American, whose name was Fred Tone, was on the floor of the plant one day and was watching car frames being loaded and stacked in the plant. They were being stacked upside down. Instead of having the axles and springs underneath the frame, he came up with the idea of having the axles and springs above the frame. The frames would be underslung. He got his folks working on that, and they came up with this classic. It's on loan to the museum from Rob Kauffman and RK Motors in Charlotte. Now we're going to take a look at another very famous and very rare car from the brass car era. Wow, there's a lot to talk about here. This is a 1907 Renault Type AI 35-45 horsepower Vanderbilt Racer. Maybe the best place to start is the Vanderbilt part. The reference is to William K. Vanderbilt II. Willie K, they called him. He was the great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who started the Vanderbilt fortune. Willie K was the president of the New York Central Railroad. He loved yachts and horse racing, but his passion was automobiles. Willie K owned race cars and he drove race cars. In 1904, he set a new land speed record of 92 miles per hour on the beach at Daytona. Willie K also in 1904 established the famous Vanderbilt Cup race on Long Island in New York. These were the first races in the U.S. to attract a substantial number of competitors from Europe. As a little footnote here, in 1911 the Vanderbilt Cup race was held on a street course in Savannah, Georgia. It was won by smiling Ralph Mulford, driving a Lozier. Now about the manufacturer of this car. Renault, just after the turn of the century, was building some of the most advanced race cars in the world. In 1906, a Renault racer won the French Grand Prix. When he heard about it, Willie K contacted Renault, he probably sent them a telegram, and asked if they would build him a slightly scaled-down version of the Grand Prix racer. They said yes, but he would need to find 9 other buyers to make it feasible. He said no worries and started contacting his rich racing buddies about buying one. So Renault built this tranche of 10 cars, maybe 12, it's unclear today. This is one of those cars, and only 4 or 5 still exists. This is on loan from the Audrain Museum in Newport, Rhode Island. So much to talk about here. You've got the engine mounted farther back on the front of the car with the radiator at the back of the engine. This supposedly gave the car a lower center of gravity and better handling qualities. Now take a look at this. There's this little devotional medal attached to the dashboard. It appears to be St. Christopher, who's the patron saint of safe driving and transportation, among other things. He's carrying his staff in one hand and carrying the Christ child on his left shoulder. It has this phrase above it that roughly translates to, "Look at my image and go on reassured." Travelers often wore St. Christopher medals for safe travel and displayed them in their cars. This is just a stunning example of a car from the brass car era and the only car in the exhibit from a non-U.S. manufacturer. This is on loan from the Audrain Museum in Newport, Rhode Island. Now let's take a look at another car that was made in Indiana. Howard Marmon's company built cars in Indianapolis from 1902 to 1933. These cars were large, luxurious, and expensive. This is a 1913 Marmon Speedster. It's on loan from Bill and Anne Marsh of Stone Mountain, Georgia. The price for a Marmon Speedster like this one was $5,000 back in the day. That would be about $150,000 today. This is a Model 48 Speedster. A Marmon Model 32 won the very first Indy 500 in 1911, driven by Ray Haroon. The car was known as the Marmon Wasp because it was yellow and had a pointed rear end that kind of looked like the stinger on a wasp. The first Indy 500 was a rough and tumble affair. They had this new timing system and had tens of employees keeping up with each car, and they were double checking one another, but it still resulted in chaos. Several different drivers claimed that they had won, and there were conflicting claims about whether all the drivers had driven all the laps. The story is that the race officials holed up for a day and a half and then announced that Ray Haroon had won in his Marmon Wasp. They then had all the records destroyed. Haroon had won, although several other cars were faster. He had figured out that if you could avoid an engine disaster, you could win with tire management, and suspected that tires were the weak link for all these cars. Changing tires in those days was slow. It took minutes instead of seconds. He figured if he could limit his speed, he could save his tires, and he did so. Faster cars would pass him and then have to pit to change tires. Haroon finished the race with an average speed of 74.6 miles per hour and only had 4 tire changes, way less than the other cars. The race lasted almost 7 hours. Haroon then announced his retirement and never raced again, although he lived for decades after that and worked in the automobile industry as an engineer. Here are a couple of footnotes to the Indy win by the Marmon that are interesting. First, Haroon had a relief driver, which was allowed by the rules back then, who drove for about a third of the race. Second, and this was controversial, there was no mechanician, as they called him, riding with Haroon, as everybody else had back then. And racing back in those days, 2 people were in the car, the driver and the mechanician who worked the hand fuel and oil pumps. He helped with repairs, and he let the driver know when someone was coming up behind him. Haroon decided to lessen the weight of the car by going by himself. Instead of a mechanician, he had this newfangled device called a rear view mirror. You can't make this stuff up. Now let's look at a car that actually raced in that first Indy 500. This car is called the Black Beast. It's from 1909 and it's made by a company called ALCO. It's on loan to the exhibit from Howard and Roz Kroplick of East Hills, New York. ALCO, A-L-C-O, stands for American Locomotive Company. They made locomotives back in the day. And a side note that really doesn't have anything to do with this car, one of the plant managers at one of the ALCO locomotive plants was named Walter P. Chrysler, the guy who founded Chrysler. I love history. ALCO decided to expand its business to build automobiles, and it did so for a few years, from 1909 to 1913. Legend has it that they lost money on every one they built. These cars were expensive, $6,000 a piece. That translates to about $200,000 today, depending on how you calculate it. But with this one, they created a masterpiece with a lot of history behind it. It has an inline 6-cylinder engine at 680 cubic inches. It generates 100 horsepower, very powerful for a 1909. This car won the Vanderbilt Cup in both 1909 and 1910. Company advertising said it averaged 65 miles per hour in the 1910 race. That was fast for a road course. It raced in the first Indy 500 in 1911, but it got a DNF because of engine trouble. Today, this car is believed to be one of only 4 surviving cars from the first Indy 500. Now, this is really cool. On the 100th anniversary of the first Indy 500, back in 2011, they allowed the 4 survivors to take a single lap around the 2.5-mile track. They were driven by a driver from the modern era. Emerson Fittipaldi, who had won at Indy twice, drove the Black Beast, and in the passenger seat with him was Mr. Kroplick, the gentleman who owns this car. About the name of the car, it's known as the Black Beast. On the side here is painted B-E-T-E-N-O-I-R. That's a misspelling, the reason for which is lost to history as far as I could tell. The French words bête noire means black beast literally, but you spell noir as N-O-I-R-E with an E at the end, like film noir. In French, a bête noire is a black beast, but it's more than that. It's like something to be feared, kind of like a boogeyman. I think the thought process was that the other racers should fear this guy, and they should. Now let's take a look at another famous race car from 1909 that was driven by someone whose name you'll recognize. The next car that we'll take a look at is this historic 1909 Buick Model 16 race car. It's on loan to the museum for the purpose of this exhibit from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. Now, when the first Indianapolis Motor Speedway races began in 1909, there were numerous time trials and races of different lengths. The same drivers' names appear in the results of those races, and each of them drove multiple cars. Although it's hard today to look back and know exactly which car was driven by which driver in which race, it's for pretty sure that this number 34 was driven in one or more races by the famous Swiss-born driver named Louis Chevrolet. Recognize that name? This car is a Buick. That was a mark started by David Buick in 1903 that had, by the time this car was built, been acquired by a holding company that you also know called General Motors. Now, GM in 1909 was run by a guy named Billy Durant. And after that, it gets really complicated. Durant was later pushed out as the head of GM. Durant, who was quite a promoter, and Louis Chevrolet, who was quite a celebrity, and Chevrolet's brother, Arthur Chevrolet, together formed the Chevrolet Motor Company in 1911, which became part of GM when Durant regained control of GM several years later. These are rough and tumble times in the early years of the automobile industry. There's actually a plate on the interior of this car that shows that this car was driven by Louis Chevrolet in 1909, by famed driver Bob Berman, they called him Wild Bob, in 1910, and by Jesse Whitla in 1911 and 1912. Now we're going to take a look at a Roadster from 1913. This car is awesome. It's got these huge fenders, and then it's got this monocle screen windshield that I've been scratching my head about since the first time I saw the car. I guess it's to keep the bugs out of your teeth. It wouldn't do much for you in the event of a bird strike, and I guess the passenger had to fend for him or herself. Back in those days, they had lots of flat tires and they had to change tires a lot. You see back here, there are 3 spares. This arrangement is also functional in another sense, in that there are batteries inside here. And those batteries power the electric starter and the headlamps and the one tail light. They were still trying to figure things out back in those days. So the lighting on these brass era cars is particularly interesting. The acetylene gas generator was a carryover from the horse and carriage days. It was used for lighting on the carriages back in those days, but it was still relatively new in the brass car era. The way it worked was that you put water in the top part of the generator and calcium carbide, which is a chemical compound in powder form, in the bottom. And when you allow the water to drip down through a valve into the calcium carbide, a chemical reaction occurs. It produces a flammable gas called acetylene. The chemical formula is C2H2 for those of you so inclined, but if you are so inclined, you probably already know that. The acetylene travels through tubes to the headlamps. You then strike a match at the headlamp, starts a burning flame that casts light forward, aided by a mirror behind the flame. This is so clever and ingenious, and you think that it happened at a time when half of the homes in the country didn't have electricity or indoor bathrooms. They developed a system that some of the cars had that allowed you to hit a switch on the dashboard and create a spark to light the acetylene lights, kind of like the starter switch on a propane gas grill today. The next development was the Prestolite system that replaced the gas generator with this cylinder of acetylene gas. When it got empty, you would take it to the general store and either exchange it for another cylinder or get it refilled like you do propane tanks today. The side lamps were usually wicked kerosene lamps, and I have fond memories of my elderly aunts firing up the kerosene lamps when the power went out when I was a kid and was staying with them. They had this big kerosene tank outside, and they would go out every few days and bring in a container of kerosene for the stove and to refuel those lamps. That was the 1960s. Just imagine how primitive it was 50 years before that when these cars were made. Automobiles were just a weird new technology. If you had a car in a town where cars were rare, you parked it in a barn or somewhere out of sight because people would take things off them, probably as much out of curiosity as to steal things. There were even city regulations that said if you parked a car on the street, you had to have a light burning on the car all night. They were worried that some hapless driver of a horse and buggy would go barreling down the street and run into one of these things. So there were these oil lamps that people would burn at the rear of the car as long as it was parked on the street. For their part, horses were afraid of these things. They were loud, they made a lot of noise, and they caused some accidents. As I said earlier, these cars seemed like they dropped in from outer space. Imagine how they looked to people 100 years ago who had no exposure to horseless carriages. So one of the most famous and most interesting car builders in America from this time period was Harry Stutz. He grew up, where else? Indiana. His parents actually immigrated to the U.S. from Poland, and they met at Ellis Island. Harry always tinkered with engines and vehicles, and over his life he built cars, fire trucks, and even airplanes. One of his best known is the Stutz Bearcat. This car is a 1914 Bearcat. The genesis of this car, the Stutz Bearcat, goes back to the announcement of the first Indianapolis 500. Stutz recognized the opportunity for publicity that would be available to the winner of that race, and he entered a car that he built in a very short period of time to win that race. He didn't win it because his car ultimately had to have more tire changes than he anticipated, but with his driver Gil Anderson at the wheel, the Stutz finished 11th. That led to the Stutz company's new slogan, "The car that made good in a day." This is a production Bearcat. If you want to go racing in one of these, you would strip away the lights, take off the fenders, and certainly the trunk at the rear, which is really a trunk. These cars were popular with the wealthy folks and with young people who could afford them. They were kind of pricey. They were $2,000 a piece as compared to the Model T we'll take a look at later, which sold for about $500. The main competition for the Bearcat was the Mercer Raceabout that we'll see in just a few minutes. There was lots of trash talk, most of it friendly, between folks who drove those two cars. The Mercer folks would say, "You have to be nuts to drive a Stutz." And the Stutz folks would say, "There's nothing worser than driving a Mercer." Beautiful car, and one of the best known from this time period. This Stutz Bearcat is on loan to the museum for the purpose of the Fast Brass exhibit from Corky and Theresa Coker and the Coker Museum in Chattanooga. Now we're going to take out another one of Harry Stutz cars. This is another car from Harry Stutz Company. This is a 1915 H.C.S. Speedster. As I mentioned earlier, a Stutz Bearcat sold for about $2,000, which made it kind of pricey. Harry Stutz thought that there was a market for a similar but less expensive car, so his company developed what Stutz called the Baby Bearcat. It had a shorter wheelbase and a smaller engine, and it sold for about 25% less than the Bearcat. By the way, H.C.S. stands for Harry Clayton Stutz. Harry Stutz apparently made a bad marketing call with this one because it was only sold for one model year. This rare car is on loan to the museum from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. Now we're going to take a look at a much bigger car from this era, a Packard. This car, big car, is a 1912 Packard Model 30. It's on loan from Tom and Mary Jo Heckman of Newton Square, Pennsylvania. The car is called a Model 30 because the four-cylinder engine in the car generates 30 horsepower. James Packard, along with his brother William and an outside investor, created what became the Packard Car Company. The legend is that James Packard bought a Winton runabout in 1898. That was a famous early car made by Alexander Winton. But James Packard apparently had some problems with the car and also had some ideas for improvement. And he corresponded with Mr. Winton about those things. Winton supposedly at some point became indignant and essentially told Mr. Packard that if Mr. Packard thought he could build a better car, he should go ahead and build it. Now, reasonable people can differ about which car was better back in the day, but Packard produced his first car the following year, and his company built great luxury cars for decades thereafter. By the way, the Packard brothers' younger sister was the first female special agent in the history of the FBI. The Model 30 was produced from 1907 until 1912, and this car is from the final model year. So at the rear of the car is a single seat that literally sits on top of the fuel tank. Riding in a motor car was risky business back in those days. Under the social customs of those times, it was not considered proper for a gentleman and a lady to go for rides out in the countryside without a chaperone, like maybe the woman's older brother. This seat, therefore, is called a chaperone seat. The 1912 model year was the last year Packard offered a four-cylinder engine. It would be replaced by the Packard 6, which in several forms would be sold by Packard for decades. So, I mentioned earlier that the main competitor for the Stutz Bearcat was the Mercer Raceabout. Now we're going to take a look at that car. So I mentioned earlier the Mercer Raceabout. This incredibly cool car is a raceabout on loan to the museum from Jack and Drena Miller of Fayetteville, Georgia. 1911 was the first model year for Mercer. This raceabout was both a street and a racing machine. Supposedly you could drive your daily driver automobile to the race course and in 20 minutes take off the fenders and the gas lights and go racing. Two raceabouts ran in the inaugural Indy 500 in 1911. They finished, and legend has it that the drivers after the race reinstalled the lights and the fenders and drove them back to Trenton. The T-head four-cylinder engine was smaller than engines in other race cars. It had only 300 cubic inches, but the car was light. It had a low center of gravity and was faster in the turns than cars with larger engines. These cars were fast, with top speeds in the 80s or 90s, depending on what you read. A little bit of history. The Mercer Automobile Company was founded by members of the same family that built the Brooklyn Bridge. They had a factory in Trenton, New Jersey, and this car was built in Trenton. Trenton is in Mercer County, and that's the origin of the name. One of the founders, whose name was Washington Roebling II, was a race car driver and an automobile enthusiast. Washington, I have no idea what you call someone whose first name is Washington, was racing cars in events around Europe in 1912 when on a lark he decided to head home on a brand new steamship that was supposedly unsinkable. It was the Titanic. There were accounts afterward of him bravely helping women and children into lifeboats before the ship went down with Roebling on board. The Mercer Company continued to build cars into the mid-20s. Many people argue today that the Raceabout was the first American sports car. It was certainly among the first, and we are very happy that it was part of this exhibit. Now let's take a look at a car that arguably changed automobile history. Henry Ford introduced the first Model T in 1908. The Model T was designed to be an affordable car for the masses, as opposed to the cars that were being sold to people who were well off. Back in those days, the public had lots of reservations about these newfangled machines. Were they safe? If you somehow were able to buy one, would it be reliable and dependable? These were the questions that people had. To allay these concerns, automobile manufacturers and their supporters began to hold events to prove that cars would be reliable. The first plan was to call these events races, but that raised eyebrows. Racing was dangerous. Instead, they were often called endurance contests. One such event was organized by Robert Guggenheim. He was an heir of the Guggenheim fortune, which had been made in the mining business. He loved cars. He organized the 1909, get this, Ocean to Ocean Endurance Contest. It would start in New York and go all the way to Seattle. The first to arrive in Seattle would receive a valuable silver trophy and $2,000 in gold bullion. The manufacturer of the car would also get a load of great publicity. Well, the first car to arrive in Seattle was a Ford Model T, and Henry Ford did get a lot of favorable publicity. It's a little footnote, should be noted here. They determined a few months later that a Ford dealer had actually changed out an engine along the way, which was against the rules, and they gave the award to the second car to finish. Ford's Model T was off and running by then though, and over 20 model years, Ford would sell 15 million Model Ts. This beautiful Model T Speedster is owned by Thomas and Jill Lee of Newton Square, Pennsylvania. It's got this pretty V-style radiator and a monocle windshield. You had to carry some extra supplies with you back in those days, and here you can see these canteens in this container on the running board next to the acetylene gas generator. These canteens would carry gasoline, oil, and water. It would seem logical to me that gasoline would be red, water would be blue, and that would leave green for oil, but I don't really know. This is such a beautiful car. I love this dark red color. Man, these brass cars are amazing. Although they seem to us today like they could have arrived from another planet, they're beautiful, and they're steps along the way to what we think of as the modern automobile. You have to wonder if 100 years from now, folks will look back on our cars and wonder why we did what we did and why today's cars worked in such a primitive sort of way. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for watching. I'm Steve Starling, and we'll see you next time.